two households, both alike in dignity. In fair Verona, where we lay our scene. The first time I read Romeo and Juliet, I was like, this is weak, I don't get it. This ain't got nothing to do with my life. Now, when I read it, it's like, this is what's going on in my neighborhood right now, Richmond, California. Welcome to my city.
Last weekend, we had a shooting every night. And one night, we had 2 shootings. So we have a gang problem.
It's about North versus Central. The reason why we are fighting is because our parents was fighting.
My little brother, it was really easy for him to be a thug. It's in his bloodline.
When I was a little kid, I always envisioned myself being somebody important. I want to be one of the biggest drug dealers in Richmond. Nah, the Bay Area.
Can you face it? You either die at a young age, tell or be in a cage, rob, be a renegade, lie, it's a lie. She know that crime pays 5 blades in my veins, hustle to you for the pain, lie, it's a lie.
Donté was at that interesting crossroads where he had just discovered spoken word. I didn't know if he'd be interested in teaching.
It was either that or the streets, so I changed my profession. We finna take Romeo and Juliet, rewrite it, and make it fit Richmond. Romeo is from North Richmond, Juliet is from Central. That's what make it like, ooh. And they were black? Ooh. I really started looking at hustling and just killing your own people, bro. You're killing your own people. Step forward if you have lost someone to gun violence. I got a community dependent on me. I can't let fear stop me from doing what I gotta do. My little brother just got killed a couple days ago.
This war zone of torn flesh tonight. Love and Richmond is possible.
Art is an imitation of life. I had control over how the play ended. In life, you have very little.
Hello, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start, there's obviously a lot to talk about with this documentary, but maybe we should go back to before it was ever a documentary. Jason, where did you first hear of Donté and his work with Raw Talent? Where did this idea start?
Yeah, this all started at my grandma's 80th birthday party about 5 years ago.
Please go on.
My cousin Molly Rayner moved to the Bay Area about 10 years ago and started teaching poetry. And Donté was actually her very first student.
Right.
And so all the way back then, she would come to family gatherings and say, you know, it's my first student, but I really think he's got something special. Wow. And from their collaboration, I saw him grow as an artist from, you know, his first poem onwards. Mm-hmm. And about 5 years ago, he was embarking on an autobiographical version of Romeo and Juliet, right. Which just struck me as the perfect framework for a film. So I went up there and I met Donté and we talked about it, and we decided to collaborate on this.
Donté, maybe the bigger the platform, always the better for Raw Talent and RYSC Youth Center. But were there any nerves to letting cameras kind of follow you around and put this whole story out for everyone to see?
Definitely, because the story that I was talking about is really impacting my city. My city is a small little town. Everybody is connected. And so to talk about my personal pains that's tied to the violence in the community, I was more nervous about my Richmond community. And then you want to film it, and I'm like, it's my first time writing a play. I don't even know if it's going to be that good, and then you filming it. So we got the extra pressure of talking about something that's really sensitive in an art form, using Romeo and Juliet, and that pressure of recreating it and then filming that. It was definitely a lot of pressure, but once we started doing it, and we got a lot of support, it was like, oh, we got to do this all the way.
Was it hard to get your whole family on board? I mean, we meet a number of your siblings throughout these confessionals or these interviews, but was anybody else sort of saying, I don't think so, we shouldn't go this far?
My pops, he wanted me to tell it. He just didn't want to. I wanted to get an interview with him because he could really talk to a lot of the stuff. But he was camera shy. A couple of my brothers, they didn't want to. Like, I don't want to be on camera. But then eventually they got a part of it. Some folks in the community as well. Wasn't no one discouraging me from doing it. They was just too afraid to actually put their voice on document. But I did it for them.
That's awesome. Russell, when did you get involved? What was
I was
sort
the
of
last
inspiring?
involved. I mean, after they won a gazillion awards, they came to me and they asked me if I had any ideas I had, and I gave them a few ideas for editing, and they took them and made them much better. But really, what I had an affinity for poetry for a very long time. And, you know, I think of all the angels in hip-hop, and there's dance, and there's rap, and there's all that. The spoken word is one of the better angels, right? Because silence is golden. Rapping on music, you know, is one thing, and I get it, and I loved it my whole life. But you know, music is going to inform what they're going to say. You know, it's celebratory, or you can hear it in the music, and it's also a chance to hide the voice. But the true voice that comes from in here, you know, when you speak in the silence, you have to really bring it. And I think that's a great thing that we want artists to do, because artists, you know, inside is where everything exists. Whatever's in scripture is etched inside your soul. Whatever's been taught you that you said that's right, it's because you rang a bell. If you're listening, most people, the world is informing them and not their inside. So poetry is a way to really bring out the heart. Throughout the ages, we know that that's what they've done. And so me always supporting poets over the years and then seeing someone as great as him. This man is, like, you know, I'm going to ask him to give you a poem later, and y'all ain't going to believe it, but he's so talented. And this idea of creating this haven for the people who are suffering in that community and shining a light on that community, and then also helping to further the whole spoken word movement. And y'all haven't seen the film. This film is amazing. You know, I get somebody from one part of the world, somebody from a whole different mindset and place, and put them in a room and they'll cry together because it speaks to the human experience, even though it's only about Richmond.
Was there anything that surprised you uniquely about the Richmond poetry, like what you saw in this film?
It's not unique, it's beautiful. I mean, in other words, every individual, every poet, you know, is unique. But the thing about Donté is he's especially brilliant. It's funny that we were inspired by the same poet. I wasn't going to do deaf poetry. My brother, Danny Simmons, brought me deaf poetry. I was like, he said, no, it's really happening. I said, yeah, you know, finger pop and all that, you know, hip hop. And he said, no, and he brought me a poet, and a few poems. But this guy was at a showcase, Black Ice, and we saw Black Ice. He saw him, and it made him a poet. And I saw Black Ice, and made me want to promote poetry, because I figured it's like, how do you make poetry accessible or mainstream? You know, so I always like to make things bigger, and I like to get them and something I feel in my heart usually is not because I'm following the leader, but because I got a gut feeling about something, no matter how different or new. And when I saw Black Ice, I knew that he and that kind of poet, that spoken word could be, you know, seen. And we got a Tony and Peabody Awards and all that stuff because of it, because it really was a commercial moment. That moment is now re-emerged, and he's like the best voice I've seen.
That's good to hear. That's nice. To go back to maybe the filming of this, there's obviously a lot of compelling material, not just within your own life with the history of Richmond. What was the greatest challenge with then shaping that into, you know, a feature-length film?
Yeah, so as soon as you start to dig into Danté's poetry, you'll quickly discover much bigger themes. And I think that part of what drew me to expanding this out into a feature film is the idea that Richmond is representative of so many communities all across America. And so when you look at the story that Danté's telling through his words, you're finding a uniquely American experience. I mean, Richmond is a city that built the majority of the US Navy during World War II. Rosie the Riveter, that icon, comes from Richmond, California. And you see now, you know, 60, 70 years down the line, just kind of a steady decline in that community. And so I feel like if you can use his poetry to tell that story, which was our approach in the filmmaking, then you tap into something very universal through something as specific as the words that he's chosen. So as much as we could, we let the poetry guide the way and just tried to match the aesthetic in our filmmaking.
There's obviously a lot of violence that has shaped the history of this film, or rather the reality that this film follows. And America has certainly an obsession, some would call it, with guns and violence. How do you as a documentarian respectfully acknowledge that without exploiting it in a way for entertainment?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to define your point of view and stick to it, right? So we're very lucky to see the world through Dante's eyes in this film. And as filmmakers, we researched all the bigger issues and made sure to get our facts straight and made sure to talk to everyone in the community, both sides of this turf war that we were exploring, the younger generation, the older generation, the mayor, police officers. We got it from all perspectives to make sure that we could tell a balanced, fair story. But then at the end of the day, it's looking at the world through Dante's eyes. And so, you know, gun violence has impacted his life. And if it's true to his story, then we can go there as filmmakers.
Obviously, the central narrative here is your adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. And I think pretty early on, you say it in the trailer, you certainly say it early on in the film, that it took you a while to come around to that play, to say, oh, this totally applies to Richmond. Can you tell me about that aha moment where you said, this is not some weird old play, this is right now?
We was doing another show, and my mentor, Ruben Morgan, he was directing that show. And once we was looking for a venue, he saw this balcony, and he was like, this would be a beautiful Romeo and Juliet balcony scene, and he laughed. And Molly Rayner, she laughs like, oh, that'd be dope. We should do that in Richmond. So they was rallying around the idea, and I was like, nah, I don't see, my people ain't coming to that. It's not Richmond. We ain't finna be dancing around in tights and all of that. They not gonna come. That was my words. And then I realized, like, hold up, what if we were to do it in Richmond, it had to fit our situation. And I'm like, what's the basics? It's two sides feuding, and then there's young people that fall in love. I'm like, well, my neighborhood feuding with my students' neighborhood, and we here right now with the love of poetry. I'm like, well, then that's the story. So we're not going to use just Romeo and Juliet. We're going to use that to bring the audience into our world, but then we're going to bring you into our world towards the end and tell you, like, this is not something that we're acting. Like, my family is really the Montagues, and theirs is really the Capulets, and this is really what we live in. And the documentary captured that. So the aha moment was, Romeo and Juliet is romanticized, and we are demonized. If I can get the world to see us like Romeo and Juliet, then maybe they'll have more compassion for Chicago and Detroit and New Orleans and St. Louis and then Richmond, California.
What was it like then pitching that to the high school students? I mean, that's a tough sell in any high school in America or maybe the world.
Man, I think the first question was like, how many of y'all read Romeo and Juliet? And probably like a couple raised their hands. Or if half of them raised their hands, like, how many of you like it? And then it was probably like one or two people who had their hands up. And I'm like, all right, so we finna take this story because it's pretty much our lives. And it was like, I don't really understand, like, what is it? And I just broke it down, like, Montague is north, Capulets is central. Right. Romeo is this person, Juliet is that person, and they fighting. Do you know why your family is fighting? Well, in Romeo and Juliet, they don't really talk about why the Montagues and Capulets don't like each other. Do y'all know why we funking in the streets? They're like, no. I said, then that's our story. But we gonna tell it in the way that we talk. We gonna stage it in our environment. So when they have the balcony scene, it's like, well, we don't have no balcony, so we did our balcony scene in Target because that's where everybody go and shop at, just to make it funny and more relatable. So when they saw it through that lens of, dang, we gonna take these locations that's iconic to this story and put it in our community, then they was like, oh yeah, let's do that.
We get to know a lot of these people over the course of this film, and Denise is perfect, like, particularly moving. You talked in one of your editorial meetings about hoping she opens up, hoping she gets more vulnerable, and we see that in the end in the play. I'm curious what it was like to live that in real life and know that the work is doing this, but then also see it happen again.
Especially for all of us, but in Denise particularly, we grow up with a shell to protect ourselves, especially young women, because men like myself take advantage of these young ladies. And a lot of them don't make it up out of those abusive situations. So to see her challenge herself to open up to the character and to open up on camera for the first time as a role that's really her life was beautiful. And it also challenged me to step into my role as like, okay, I'm talking about a story, but I don't want to just talk about it. I really want this to also have an impact on myself. So I wanted to challenge myself to go deeper and to live through that moment, but then to see it played out and then to see the response the audience has is like, it's beautiful.
It is beautiful. Obviously, you don't get to control the plot when you're shooting a documentary, but it does feel like the film is cheering for her to open up. What was it like for you to capture that?
Denise has been one of the more rewarding parts of the process because, I mean, we're filming during such a specific time in her life, senior year of high school, right? And that's very generous of her in the first place to let us film with her during senior year. But she did undergo a transformation that year, and she really did step up to her role in this play and grow into herself. And I think what I've really loved to see through the process of screening the film is she just continues to grow, and she really has owned this role, participating in talkbacks and inspiring youth. And I mean, she's traveled the country with us and really, really blossomed. So that's been fantastic to see.
She's sort of used as a way to segue into the particular challenges that young women face in Richmond. We get a lot of very compelling interviews during that segment. I'm wondering, for three men watching the film, what most surprised you about their testimonies?
For me, it wasn't really surprising because I was already working with them years prior, and they came out about a lot of the things that they was going through. But what I've learned in that process is like, wow, like, I know that everybody is struggling because I'm coming from the same community, but when these young ladies talk about the sexual abuse, the neglect, abortions, and just things like that, as being the male that's in their life, is like, I look like the men that has neglected or abused them. So for them to entrust in me with telling me that story and to look up to me, it was just like, that also helped transform the way that I approached everything with that sensitivity.
Russell, you have daughters. They grew up in a different world, but I'm curious if it made you think about their experiences in a different way.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it's not a different way. I mean, I hear these stories. I see these things pretty regularly. As I'm involved in whatever transformative process I can be, where I can be useful. So I've been involved in this kind of thing, and it is a real experience. And I talk about inequality all the time, and the lack of sensibility or compassion on the part of all of us, and kind of we turn our back to stuff that becomes almost the norm, and then no one thinks that we're listening because we won't. We don't even process stuff we don't want to process a lot of times. So we have lots of unconscious behavior, and it goes on. And so to dig and find this and to bring it to the forefront, everybody's, but I kind of accept that there's that suffering, and I want to be part of alleviating it. I want to make sure my daughters don't experience it, but I also want to make sure that becomes a mantra to stand up to that kind of abuse. And so that, for me, is, I accept that suffering is there, and I accept that it's my job to remove it.
Right. Jason, maybe you can speak more generally. Throughout the filming of this process, what did you not expect to learn that you learned?
I learned a lot from the members in Raw Talent. I mean, it's very easy for me to hide behind a camera and hide in my edit bay and, speak through others about openness and courage. But man, was I inspired by just how courageous, the act of staging this play, the act of writing and being so vulnerable in front of the community. But I saw, when they premiere the play, and you see it in the film, this incredible night of just communal catharsis. Like, that was the most electric theater I've ever been in. You could feel everyone absorbing the vulnerability from these students and cheering them on for it. And it was incredible, and it's inspired me to strive to be more vulnerable and just more open in general.
Donté, I'm sure your work feels very insular, working with these people one-on-one, face-to-face on a daily basis. What was it like to see your story put on not just a communal level, but then now on a national level? This is a bigger conversation than just Richmond.
It's beautiful because once I started writing, especially for poetry, because in the Bay Area, we have a big poetry scene in Oakland, San Francisco, and Berkeley, but Richmond is always overlooked. Even within the Bay Area, it's like, dang, so I wanted to make sure, I'm finna put Raw Talent in Richmond on the map, and I'm finna make sure that we do our thing. So to come from that thought, to see it documented on this film, a brief 6 months of doing one production, and we did probably like 20 productions before this documentary. So to see it reach not only the Bay Area, but now broader, is just a beautiful experience.
That's awesome. We spoke before that this really started in 2012. That was way before the Donald Trump presidency, when we're seeing all these cuts for the arts programs and all of these new struggles. Does it renew all of your energy into all these projects? How are you reacting to all of these things?
Well, let me say that I had a fundraiser on Saturday, Public Enemy
Art for Life.
performed, Art for Life. And, you know, it's an ongoing process to try to get people to see the value in art and to fund programs that they won't fund. So, you know, us raising $1 million or a few $1 million is, you know, it's a drop in the bucket. Hopefully some media covers it and people realize it and people go home and they be part of a process. I mean, you know, I try to stay encouraged, but, you know, sometimes it feels like shoveling against the tide. It's true. They've been cutting art programs since, you know, I can remember.
Right.
And it's like the imagination is everything. If you don't fund creative process and you don't teach kids to think, you can't even step one step in front of the other unless you imagine that step first. The imagination is everything. And so the creative process is critical. It needs funding, it needs support. Artists need to do spoken word. You know, spoken word, I'm glad it's here because then kids will do it without counting on Donald Trump, you know. They can do it on their own. They rap already, but, you know, the more that they operate from stillness and silence, the more they'll say things that, you know, will set them on the right path. And I see a lot, even in the music, you see a lot of conscious lyrics about things that matter because if not, you know, we're blind while they're talking about Russia. They're killing more black people than ever. Right now, more people are being shot and there's no community police dialogue. It's not worth talking about and so no one's changing it. And, you know, the amount of kids that got shot this weekend in Chicago, does anybody even know? Probably 50 kids. Does anybody know? So this ongoing struggle that happens in our community has to be documented, it has to be told to everyone, and we have to figure a way out of the suffering. And out of the suffering through art is critical. You know, if you don't imagine it, it can't happen.
We talked about, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, that, you know, there is a lot of activism that you have moments where it feels like you're beating your head against a wall. And if you look at any of your socials, most of your interviews, you do have an overwhelmingly positive response to these things. In those moments, where are you culling that positivity from? What keeps you motivated?
You know, something that Donté said, which I totally agree with, you know, the imagination is everything I said. You have to decide, you know, the yogi is always recommitting. You have to come back over and over again. Remember this positivity and remember to remember it. This is how you wake up. 80% of your thoughts are negative. You have to turn those thoughts around. That's a practice. It's not something that just, oh, I'm going to turn my thoughts around. No, because then you know, why do you think we chant the name of God over and over? Not because we can't spell his name, because we forget, right? So this is about remembering to remember. And that's, you know, getting people to see something better. You know, and I think that's what we have to do as individuals, because also you said, Donté, which I thought was great, is that the transformation process for the planet begins with you. And if you don't change yourself, you can't change nothing. And change yourself and you'll go about it gracefully and you won't even struggle with the way it is. You just do the best you can do to make it the way it should be, without struggle, without crying or being sad. Just go around to people and try to give them the best you can give them. And then that becomes your work, and you don't have to worry about the result. The work is the prayer. Can we make the work something special?
Donté, I have a similar question for you. There's a point later in the film where you are sort of considering your neighborhood, and you say the people who are trying to change it get killed, and the people who are sort of engaging in gang violence also get killed. So what is to do when that is the reality? And I'm curious, in the face of that reality, you've obviously found some positivity or motivation. Where are you finding that?
Just believing in a higher power. I believe that everybody was created, everything that's in existence was created for a purpose, and it depends on each other, and everybody just had to figure out what your position is and play it. I remember sending a prayer up when I was summer 2008 when I first graduated from high school, because my goal was to go back to the streets, but I'm like, I want to do something greater. I'm like, if I was born, then I have a purpose, and I'm not going to be able to succeed until I know what that is. So reveal that to me. And then this came as another opportunity. Like, do you want to, come and work with these young people as far as writing? And I took that window of opportunity. And within that, I realized, it's a lot of people that's hurting, but ain't nobody really speaking about it that looks like them, that speaks like them, that will walk where they're struggling at. You know what I mean? So just taking that, and that's what I gave my all to it.
You mentioned earlier that Raw had done plenty of productions prior to Romeo and Juliet adaptation. What are you guys working on now? What is the group sort of inspired by?
As far as Raw Talent, it's not necessarily like an organization. It was just a group, a collective of young artists who graduated. A lot of folks moved on, but a lot of other folks stayed around. And my brother DeAndre, he's in the film. He had just had a play I had co-directed, and he had wrote. It's called Richmond Renaissance, talking about the 1940s in North Richmond and how the blues and jazz sparked a lot of known musicians' careers out there in the Bay Area and Richmond. We had just did that in May 7th and 8th out in Richmond. It's another play in the works. So it's just more like productions that allow young people really from the community to get involved, whether they are actors or not, to just explore that expression for healing purposes mostly.
I think something so interesting in the film is I was especially thinking of this during the Chevron stuff when you look at the way this is impacting the young people's health, the high rates of asthma. It almost doesn't make sense to stay in Richmond when you achieve an ability to leave, but yet you're very embedded there. You've got an organization, you're motivated to sort of turn this place around. Is that being welcomed? Do you feel supported? How is the community reacting to all of that?
Since I've started 9 years ago, 10 years ago, I've always got nothing but support from people who come from the streets and people who don't know nothing about my world. Young and older has been very encouraging and inspired by the work not only that I do, but the young people that I surround myself with and the words that come from them. I feel like a lot of people, they just need to see it in order to believe it.
This film has been years in the making, as we have mentioned. It hits theaters this month. It will be available next month whenever people want to stream it. When you think about that and all these new eyes that are going to be on it, what do you each hope for their viewing experience or hope that they get out of this experience?
Well, I hope that people will see this as an opportunity for themselves. I mean, they'll see him, and in him, they'll see themselves. I mean, he could have been in jail or dead, right? And he's not. And he's saving people from jail and death. And people who are in tenuous situations can see it, maybe push them over the edge to do something more inspired. And, you know, the movie is supposed to make people walk away. It's like renewed, born again, ready to go do it, And that's what I hope for the movie to do, is to make people feel that they can be a better catalyst for more good, and that would be it'd be for their betterment that they serve others, and they'll see him doing it, and they'll want to do it too.
Awesome. Donté and Jason?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to follow Russell, but I'll say, for the sake of expanding upon that, right now we're living in a very divided times. There's a lot of xenophobia, and beyond people discovering the power of their own voice, I think that it's important to, humanize the experience of Richmond and communities like Richmond. And it's easy to ignore a lot of communities and pretend they don't exist, like you were saying about Chicago. But really, I think that we should start looking at all communities, but especially communities like Richmond, as perhaps the home for the next great American artist, next great American writer, and really support and champion that.
Awesome. And then Donté, to end.
I want people to take away that you are in a position of power, no matter where you at in the world, whether you are incarcerated, a janitor, a clerk, or you're a billionaire, you are in a position of power, and it's up to you to do something to uplift people, to uplift community with your thoughts, with your words, and with your deeds, your actions. And once you do that, then that's going to solve it. Money's not going to solve it. Voting is not going to solve it, because if your heart and your mind is not with pure intentions to see folks do better spiritually, then everything else you're doing is just a distraction, and it's a circus, and you're wasting time. So to walk away knowing that the power starts with the thought, it comes out with the words, and it's followed by the action.
That's awesome. Well, they've been waiting patiently, but we do have some questions from the audience. I'm going to start over here.
Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to see the film, and I'm a really strong believer in the power of the arts. I think this film really demonstrates that. So I'm wondering what you guys think. If we're not parents, if we don't necessarily have money to donate to arts programs, how can we help? How can we get involved?
Well, if you're an artist, I say participate by speaking your truth. If you're not an artist, then go to an event where art is being displayed and just give. That's encouraging. It's nothing more encouraging than to be an artist, to have something to show the world, and then folks come to see it, to view it, to experience it, and then clap. And then afterwards come up and say, I heard what you said, or I saw what you did, and I appreciate that. So that's one way you can get involved.
That's great. And then we've got another one over here.
Hello, gentlemen. I wanted to ask you guys, being that you are all from different walks of life, we see stories on the news every day about different types of violence, gun violence, and everything like that. What about this young man's story made you say, I have to help him tell a story? What separated him from everybody else?
I mean, I tell everyone this. Donté is my favorite artist, you know? And it comes from a place of, as a filmmaker, I was dying to collaborate with him as an artist. And when you start to dig into his work, that leads you very quickly towards a lot of these bigger issues. But for me, this started as a collaboration between two artists, and it's grown from there. And yeah, I just really respect his work. And what better opportunity than to document one of your favorite artists at the very beginning of the journey. He's going places, right? And we got to capture him at the beginning, so that was incredible.
And then we've got one final question.
Hi, after working together, is there anything that you guys learned from each other and that you're taking away from creating this film?
I want to ask that question. I want to answer our question.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Give me that poem.
Oh, the poem?
Yeah, give me the poem. That's why I want to talk with West Shoulders.
As morning dew glaze across cracked bottles and torn plastic and uncultivated soil, in a crammed space rumbles an appetite deep inside Section 8 housing beneath a rusted ceiling where iron tears and a quivering pit bellows off the cliff notes to Yah, here lies a brown boy who awakes to a molding frost setting into his bones. The third morning this week, he struggled to climb out from his weeping puddle, searched through rubble for watered ground to plant his weary feet. It's the pieces of watching your best friend head explode in front of you. The sight, mind-blowing to say the least, don't you think? With scrawny shoulders and sinking faith, this brown boy carries 17 caskets and unfinished homework on his back as he drags himself through a thick cloud of purple smoke to stagger down a condemned pathway to the end of your classroom, cuffed in a black hooded sweatshirt made obituary there in the corners where he fold, crumble at each tick of that clock, knowing that in here or out there on that block we waste, where the living usually forgets about the dead. Oh, is that why these teachers don't see us? If metallic locks and slave ships be the only things planned in your lessons, then how can you free us, huh? How can you reach us with firm grip if your hands are full from holding on to Eurocentric lectures? They treat us absent when they don't feel connected to our presence, huh? You can't call on raised hands of ghosts, so we float. Hallway glide to daunt at locker room gatherings for a post. We host school grounds as purgatory. We pretend that diploma will exempt us from a white man's gun. Street sweep this poverty and teach me back my native tongue. Like really though, like really know the people you're supposed to be serving. Or is it that you do know and you are afraid of our awakening?
Well, that's all for, I don't think there's any other way to end that. Thank you guys so much for being here.